Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. My name is Willem Middelburg, and I will be your host today for today's Data Science Institute webinar, about which we are going to talk about personal data and how this is a key responsibility in everyone's work. In the next few minutes, I'll start with a brief introduction about some of the logistics of today's session, and after that, we'll dive right into the topic. Before we get started, just a few notes around the logistics of today's session. Note that the entire session today is going to be recorded. So if you're choosing to join us live, note that your voice will also be recorded and that this recording will be published online on our YouTube and other social media channels afterwards. One of the key benefits of joining a session like today live is that you have the ability to ask questions. We're using the Teams solution for webinars today. So at the top of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. Until the end of the session, we will mute all of the participants. So if you have any questions in between, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the top of your screen, and I will moderate some of the questions towards the end. And last but not least, note that the slides of today's session will be distributed to everyone who's watching today and will be uploaded on our Slideant account. There's no need to make screenshots or to make photographs of the slides because you will get a full copy of the deck. Now, with those logistical notes out of the way, let's get started and start with a brief introduction. My name is Willem Middelburg, and I'm the President and Chief Examiner at the Data Science Institute, better known as DASCIN. The Data Science Institute is an independent organization that promotes the responsible and sustainable use of data and publishes best practices and publications around how to use this within an organizational context. My role is to oversee the quality of the exams worldwide and to make sure new programs are being developed that are accurate, fact-based, and vendor independent. If I'm not working on the examination-related requirements or teaching, I am also very frequently involved with writing. And what I'm going to show you today in the webinar is some of the materials that are coming from my books, especially the ones on the Enterprise Big Data Framework, as well as the GDPR Handbook, which contains a lot of information around how to use data in a responsible manner. Good. Today's session is being brought to you by the Data Science Institute, which is an independent body of knowledge for the advancement of data best practices. DASCIN publishes certification, education schemes, course materials, e-learnings, and lots of knowledge sessions to improve people's understanding of the responsible use of data. On top of that, DASCIN has one of the largest member communities on the planet and is seen as an independent knowledge hub for everything related to data. In case you would like to learn more about the Data Science Institute, I highly encourage you to check out our link at www.dascin.org. Good, so let's dive right away into the main topics for today. I thought it would be interesting for today's session to dive a little bit deeper into data privacy requirements, and the way in which organizations need to deal with data on a day-to-day basis. If I can tell you one thing from years of experience is that data privacy, and especially the organizational controls that need to be in place to safeguard that, are frequently underestimated. And lots of organizations can actually still take some significant steps in order to make this better. What I'm going to show you today is what we understand as personal data, because there might be some differences of an interpretation there, but also where risks are hidden in organizations and what you can do about it. Last but not least, I will also cover some of the basics of how you do ensure that you process data in a lawful way and that your organization keeps up to par towards the latest standards and compliance regulations. So without further ado, let's dive right into it and look at some of the key basics first. I'd like to start with a very simple statement, and that is that privacy protection isn't IT's job, it's everyone's job. One of the main objections and elements that I typically hear is that a lot of people think that the protection of data, and especially data privacy, is either a security requirement or an IT requirement. And it's up to the IT or the legal department to ensure that data safety and data privacy is safeguarded in the proper ways. But in today's session, I hope I will explain a little bit deeper to you why that is absolutely not the case, and why everyone in an organization, no matter which role or which department you're from, has a very important role to play in the execution of this. And this is also why some knowledge about this aspect is so fundamentally important. Good, let's start with a quick definition and look what we are actually going to be talking about, especially when it comes to privacy protection. Note that when we talk about private data, it is everything that touches on personal data. I'll explain that difference in a second. And that means within HR, sales, or in the public sector, doesn't really matter which type of organization there is a shared responsibility for protecting data privacy across any type of organization. Now, a little bit later, I will explain some of the key phrases and context of the General Data Protection Regulation, better known as GDPR. And there they call this principle accountability. And it means that accountability is there for everyone and not just for instance, for the legal department or the data protection officer. In order to get started with this, let's first dive a little bit deeper around what do we actually mean when we talk about personal data. And I frequently feel that this is an area of misunderstanding because many people think that this term is much narrower than it actually is. When we think about data, personal data, it relates to any information that can identify a living person. And that means either directly, but also indirectly. And I think most people are familiar that when we talk about things like your social security number, your photographs, maybe even your name, that is obviously personal data. But it includes a lot more because, for instance, you can also ID people based on their government or employee identification number. You can identify people based on an email address. You can identify people based on performance review notes or case files. Even call recordings, or when you fill in a form for a specific sales lead. And it's exactly that element that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that the way that we identify people these days online can be much more invasive than literally photographing somebody's passport or identity card. And the amount of personal data that an organization therefore processes is enormous. Think about email that lives in everyone's organization that already creates and deals and processes personal data. And this is also the reason why the protection and safeguarding of personal information is so incredibly important. So whenever you think about personal data next, think about it this way. If it can help someone single out a specific person, it is personal data, and you should treat it as personal data. So it is a much broader definition than you might originally think. Now, within the treatment of personal data, we have two different types of categories. We have personal data, but then also a more elevated aspect of personal data, which in the GDPR regulation is called a special category. Now, this is considered more sensitive data because the exposure to this data can have higher consequences and can have more impact on individuals. And as a result, this type of data also warrants more measures and more protection. Now, what do we mean with this special categories? Briefly speaking, you can identify it into 4 main areas, and these are also listed in the GDPR. The first one, and I think the most straightforward one, is biometric and genetic data. So everything that allows you to identify a person by physical or genetic information is considered a special category. Here, think about thumbprints, facial recognition, irises, and within genetic elements, obviously, the protection and collection of DNA. That requires special data processing, and as we will see a little bit later, organizations need to set higher standards in case and even if they may collect this form of information. And the second key category that we look into or place in this area is health information. So everything that identifies a person's health record, diagnosis, medical reasons, medical history is a special category, and that also requires advanced forms of protection. And again, since we all get sick and have medical records, employers of any organization will need to have more stringent systems to safeguard and store this form of information. Now, the third category that you might not be so familiar with is that under these regulations, everything that is considered racial, ethnic, or political data also meets this threshold of special category. So it is actually not allowed to, for instance, store people's political information, ethnical or racial data, or if this is required from a data processing perspective, is that we will see a little bit later, there needs to be added and elevated security measures in place. And last but not least, the same is true for criminal offenses and the criminal history. Although I hope most of you will not be falling into this category, this is at the same level as biometric and genetic or health information. Now, why is this important? The treatment of personal data and even the special category of data is part of every organization's daily work. It's not a separate task, and therefore it involves everyone and every part of the organization. So for instance, in HR, we're processing CVs. In marketing, we are managing email lists. Sales teams go through CRM records. The public sector has access to case files or applications. In all of those cases, what seems to be routine tasks and routine jobs is actually treatment and processing of personal data. And therefore, it's very easy to see that this concerns all of us. We all send email, we all look at confidential information about people, and therefore this is something that we would need to consider. And therefore, it starts with being aware that we are actually now processing personal information. And as a result, because all of us are doing this, accountability as well as responsibility for treating personal data is a shared activity. It's not that this is the responsibility for the IT or legal departments. They might set the standards and the policies and the guardrails, but the way that we utilize personal data on a day-to-day basis is something that concerns all of us. So I thought it would be interesting for today's session to share a little bit more about that and share also some of the best practices and the do's and don'ts around that. Now, I'm going to start with some small habits and some things that everyone can think about, but also everyone can apply. And one of the most frequently occurring, I would say, mistakes or things that you can do differently is the fact that a lot of people put a lot of other people in CC instead of blind copy. And that exposes every recipient's email to the whole group in just one send, and is in many cases very unnecessary. Same is true for oversharing in chat channels, especially if these are group channels, medical information, the reason people take leave, any personal identifiable information about customers. Those are big risks and that a lot of us take, and for which it could be much easier if you limit that specific exposure to the people that actually need that information. Thirdly is the encryption of your devices. A lot of people still have devices that are not properly safeguarded, or they are at a risk of losing this. And this can be misplaced laptops, USB drives, but also mobile phones and tablets. And if they're being lost, then in many cases, this is then also not reported, which makes the risk even larger. Fourthly, we see forwarding data towards personal devices just to finish things at home, or if your laptop is heavily protected, so that it becomes easier to process information on your personal device. And then number 5, which is also a habit I think many of us are guilty of, is keeping all records just in case, where there's actually no reason to keep that anymore. It will break storage limits and increase cost, but besides that, there's also a strong data privacy, data security risk with that. And then last but not least, I know social media is everyone's favorite hobby these days, but talking details about other people on public forums might lead to identification of those specific users or customers, and that also poses a big to organizations. So now that you know some of the key things that people tend to do and why that might not be such a good idea, let me go one step deeper and explain a little bit why you're allowed to use someone's data from a corporate perspective. And again, the reference standard that we're using right here is the GDPR as kind of like a regulation that guides us on how to do that responsibly. Now, a person or organization is allowed to process or safeguard and keep somebody's personal data if and only if there is a basis or one of the 6 lawful bases that you see on the screen right here. The first one is if the other party has explicitly given consent, clearly and specifically, and has stated, preferably written, that another person can process their data. Second part is if there is an underlying contract and you need to deliver something to that person and need to process that person so that the service can be provided. So a very good example is if you're signing up for an online account or for an online exam or for an online course, then obviously the company that receives your information needs to process that so that they can give you access to the service that you provided for. Thirdly is if there is a legal obligation. So many countries have employment laws that require you to keep records about employment of employees, and that is also then forms a legal basis for organizations to keep and store your personal information. The fourth one is one that I always find very interesting, and that is the vital interests. So if some information is necessary to protect somebody's life or safety, there's also a legal ground to keep and store personal information. Very closely related, if the element is part of a public task and you're carrying out official or public interest functions, and this basically allows the mandate for the government to process your personal information. And then last but not least, a legitimate business interest. And note that the word legitimate is the key right here. Should not be to convince you to sell more, but for any other form of legal requirements, regulation, or regulated aspect. Now, you might at this stage think, well, that sounds good, but what is the business implication if I don't do this? And the implications, as you can see on this next slide, is actually quite stringent. Especially organizations that are covered under GDPR have a legal obligation to deal with any breaches or any issues in which data is not properly safeguarded. And that means that they have a 72-hour window to report any breach to the regulator, especially if it's once it's discovered. They have a 1-month absolute deadline to respond to data subject rights requests. For instance, as we will see a little bit later, the rights to erase information or the right to review the information that is being kept. And the fines for this can be very, very steep, even to up to around 4% of global turnover, which is the top tier for GDPR fines. So if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, then this is a very, very significant amount. And why this is important is that breaching personal data is not generally initiated by hacks or people with malicious intentions. They generally start with ordinary moments where an email is either misdirected, screens are being read that shouldn't be read, and old files are being kept that contain, for instance, confidential or important information. Now, why is this important? What can you do about it? There are 3 habits that underpin all of this. The first part is that you should only gather personal data if you have a genuine need for the task at hand. And this is also something that is not properly understood in lots of organizations. So good examples, for instance, at the reception when people sign in, for instance, for a meeting. Now, in many organizations, you see entire forms asking for your license plate, for your passport numbers, for sometimes even to take a photo of you to enter a specific building for a simple meeting. Now, the key question that you need to ask yourself is that proportionate to the result, which in this case might be to have a simple meeting, and is it therefore necessary to collect all of that information? Wouldn't it also be perfectly fine to just have a name, a company, and for instance, an email address? Is it really necessary to collect a picture or, for instance, somebody's passport number? Secondly, is that if you collect that information, there is a responsibility for the organization to then make sure it's properly protected. So there is a mandate for security, and the people who give you your information should have a understandable confidence that you will treat and protect that information in the proper manner. And then last but not least, there is a habit that underpins it that requires you to respond fast. And if you see that something is off or that there is a data breach, then you should immediately take action, because speed might resolve a lot more things than if you wait it out and see what will happen to it. So this is a very, very important aspect and something that I would say most organizations misunderstand. Now, another key aspect to relate to that, and this is kind of like the other side of the medal, is everything about a data subject right. So instead of looking at it from an organization's perspective, let's look at it from an individual's perspective. And a data subject right basically means that you, I, and everyone who deals with organizations have the right to see, fix, delete, restrict, move, or object to data that is being stored by that specific organization. And for instance, suppose that I have given consent to an organization to process my data, and I then ask them to erase me or restrict the access or delete me from their databases, then people or organizations have an obligation to comply to that within 1 month. Now, I've been in data management, data governance for over, almost close to 2 decades. And I can assure you that many organizations don't have the proper processes in place if an actual data subject requests or asks for somebody's data to be removed or to be erased. Many organizations store a lot of customer data by default, and the question is how an organization can navigate this and set up the proper process and procedures in order to do that. Second key best practice is to immediately contact your organization in case you suspect a breach. Many people don't do this, and for instance, they click on a wrong link or a wrong email, and then they don't report that. So the best practice here is then don't hide it. Immediately contact your data protection officer, and especially if you are in the category that has regulatory reporting requirements, you do also face a time window. And that time window in most cases 7 to 2 hours that you need to file a report with the regulator in case anything happens. So what can you do about it? So now that you understand a little bit more around what are the risks and what are the rights of organizations, here are some of the key habits that in every organization will quietly reduce risks. And you can start doing these things, I would say, after today's session or even right away tomorrow to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. The first key piece of advice I'd like to give you is to always double check the recipients before you hit send in your messages, whether it's on the email, whether it's in your Teams messages, because once a message is sent, that data is transferred towards other person. And if you do that, only use the approved tools and storage facilities and don't store any data that is outside the scope of your organization's control. If you print out documents or put files on specific devices, also make sure that you dispose of them properly and destroy your devices in a secure way so that people might not be able to steal anything once that device is being retired. And in all cases, avoid sensitive chats in public spaces. Make sure that you lock your screen and phone at the moment that you step away and only collect the minimum amount of data that you actually need. And the most important part is to keep that consent measure into account, the consent measure I just mentioned, to make sure that there is always a valid reason for processing data. And if you're in doubt, in every organization, there should be a data protection officer. So if you don't know for sure, you can always reach out to that person to request more guidance. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper and look at some of the key tips by specific roles. So HR obviously deals with employee information. So one of the best practices there is to only limit that access to personal files to those people who truly need it. On the marketing side, you're dealing with customer outreach. So you should have consent mechanisms in place before adding people to marketing lists. And this is an area in which we generally see a lot of issues. In sales, make sure that you never export customer lists to personal drives or towards personal information around customers, because that runs a serious risk of being valuable information that might end up in the wrong hands. And then last but not least is always make sure that you verify identities, especially over phones, but also over emails where people might not be the ones that they say that they actually are. So key message right here is speak up. Make sure that in case there is doubt, speaking up is a strength and definitely not a mistake. And many people click on a wrong link and then start having doubts. But if you just file that away, don't do anything with it, it might take a long time before somebody actually acts upon it. But in many cases then it becomes too late. So I'd like to close and summarize today's session with a number of key takeaways, as I always do in these kinds of sessions. Few things to really think about when it comes towards personal data. Firstly, I hope that after today's session, you realize that personal data touches everyone. It's not just an IT or legal responsibility. It involves everyone in every department every single day. Secondly, I hope that you have taken away that personal data needs to be protected at all times, but that there are specific categories of data that require extra care, especially health, biometric data, So don't just store that and capture that in case it's not actually necessary to use. Thirdly, most incidents start very small, but they can become very large very quickly if you don't do anything about it. So make sure that if something happens that you report it immediately so that the appropriate action can be taken. And then lastly, remember the 3 key basic rules I just mentioned. Collect it, making sure you have the right collecting mechanism. Make sure that you then have the right protection measures in place, both from a technological as a procedural aspect. And then in case something happens, make sure that you respond fast. And then last but not least, very much in line with this, in the world of data privacy and data protection, it is very, very important to have speed. So report anything that looks different than the way it should be. If you feel like you've made a mistake, it can be corrected in most cases very quickly if you report it within a specific window. So with that, I hope you had a good understanding about some of the key points that we are trying to get across. In case you're interested to learn more about it, note that the Data Science Institute has a very, very extensive course around GDPR awareness that goes into much more detail than I have just discussed in this half hour that we have spent together. The GDPR handbook is a manual I always refer to. It contains a lot of information for a deeper and more structured response to data protection principles. So I strongly encourage you to look into that. And if you're not attending the course, to at least have a look at the GDPR handbook for a better understanding about that. Now, with that, I'd like to open up the floor to some of the key questions that came in. I saw a lot of questions coming in at the same time. So let me open up the Q&A box and we'll see some of the main questions right here. First question is, organizations sometimes unintentionally punish people for reporting mistakes. What does a healthy reporting culture actually look like? Well, that's a very good question. An organization should be very welcoming if people report mistakes. Because first and foremost, this is a way to avoid anything in the future. So punishing people for reporting is definitely the wrong way to do it. And if you are concerned for that, most people who perform a role like, for instance, the DPO have gone on courses to deal with these kinds of issues. So if you're in doubt and you don't want to report, for instance, to your boss or towards somebody directly on your team, then what I would recommend is always to single out and search for your data protection officer in your organization as a key reference point and a person that can actually address these kind of things. Next question. If someone accidentally CCs a group instead of a BCC, does that always count as a reportable breach? Or does it depend on how sensitive the exposed data is? Well, I would definitely say that it's the last category. It also really depends on whether you're sharing things, for instance, internally within your organization, and as an organization, you have that right to process the data. Or, for instance, if you have a list, let's say, with customer information, or, for instance, biometric or medical information, and you share that externally to other people. So it's not always immediately a reportable breach, but here I think use your common sense. And if you are in doubt, it's obviously better to report it as well. Next one is, what is the most important mistake people make? Well, I would say what I've seen is the whole CC culture. And what I mean with that is there are so many people that CC everyone in communication chains. And in many cases, as you might have seen from your work as well, that might lead to awkward situations if it's email chains that have been going on for a long time and people are added later. But in many cases, it's also completely unnecessary. Not everyone needs to be having information about everything all of the time. And I know that in organizations, especially large organizations, people feel, oh, if I copy in everyone. It makes it more visible, and then at least people can never say that they don't know about this. And that's what I mean with the CC culture. But very few people actually use BCC or use an actual vetting when they send those kinds of messages. So I consider that one of the major issues when you talk about sharing of confidential or private information. Good, so very good questions. So thank you so much for that. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation and for joining us in one of our next DASCIN webinars. I hope you found these useful. Note that we do these on average once or twice a month. So in case you're interested in this type of content, just sign up for our email list that gives us the consent to process your information and to invite you for these kinds of sessions. I hope you found it useful, and I really look forward to seeing you again on any of our upcoming topics. Have a look at our website to see the upcoming sessions and the topics that might be of interest to you. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for being part of the session today, and look forward to catching up with you at a later moment. Thanks, everyone.